A secret workplace romance. A dangerous obsession. A game where the risk is everything. It started as innocent flirtation, stolen glances, hushed whispers in glass-walled rooms. But soon, the thrill of getting caught became an addiction. Each late-night meeting pushed the boundaries further, the stakes rising with every reckless encounter. Then the game changed. Someone was watching. Someone who knew everything. The truth wasn't what they expected, because they weren't the players, they were the pawns. Now there's no turning back. Lies unravel, hidden desires surface, and what started as a forbidden thrill spirals into something far more dangerous. Betrayal, power, control. In the end, someone will pay the price. Stay with us to find out how this twisted game ends, and don't forget to subscribe. "What if someone walks in?" she whispered, her breath hot against my ear, her fingers digging into my shoulders as her hips pressed against mine. I swallowed hard, my eyes darting to the glass walls of the meeting room. Anyone could see us. Anyone. But that was the point, wasn't it? The thrill of it, the danger, was what kept us coming back. "They won't," I murmured, my voice low and shaky. "They're too busy with the presentation. No one's paying attention." Her lips curved into a sly smile, and she leaned in closer, her body pressing harder against me. "You're sure about that?" she teased, her voice dripping with mischief. Her hand slid down my chest, trailing lower, until I grabbed her wrist, my heart pounding. "Not here," I said quickly, my eyes scanning the room again. "Not like this." She laughed softly, pulling her hand away. "You're such a tease," she said, her voice laced with playful accusation. "But fine. We'll wait. For now." It all started innocently enough. We were co-workers, nothing more. Friendly banter in the break room, the occasional shared laugh over a ridiculous email chain. But there was always something simmering beneath the surface, something neither of us acknowledged, at least not at first. Her name was Lena. She was sharp, witty, and had this way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. She was also married. So was I. But that didn't stop the electricity that crackled between us whenever we were alone. The office didn't help. Open concept, with glass-walled meeting rooms scattered throughout. It was meant to encourage collaboration, transparency, but for us, it became something else entirely. A game. A temptation. A stage. The first time it happened, it was almost an accident. We'd been working late, the two of us, finishing up a project. The office was empty, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional ping of a distant elevator. We were in one of the meeting rooms, the glass walls offering a clear view of the deserted workspace beyond. "Finally done," Lena said, leaning back in her chair with a sigh. She stretched, her blouse riding up just enough to reveal a sliver of skin. I quickly looked away, but not fast enough. "Admiring the view?" she asked, her voice teasing. I felt my cheeks flush. "Just admiring the clock. It's late." She laughed, a soft, melodic sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Relax," she said, standing up and walking over to the whiteboard. "I'm just messing with you." But she wasn't. Not really. There was a glint in her eye, a challenge. She erased the notes from the board, her movements deliberate, her body language inviting. I should have left. I should have made an excuse and walked out the door. But I didn't. I stayed rooted to the spot, watching her as she moved, unable to tear my eyes away. When she turned to face me, her expression was unreadable. "You're staring," she said quietly. "I'm sorry," I muttered, suddenly feeling like a teenager caught in the act. She took a step closer, then another until she was standing right in front of me. "Don't be," she said softly. Her hand reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "I don't mind." And that was it. The line was crossed. One moment we were co-workers, and the next her lips were on mine, her body pressing against me, her hands tugging at my shirt. It was reckless, impulsive, and utterly intoxicating. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, I glanced at the glass walls, half expecting to see someone watching us. But the office was still empty, the only witnesses the fluorescent lights above and the silent rows of cubicles beyond. "We shouldn't do this," I said, even as my hands lingered on her hips. She smirked, her fingers trailing down my chest. "But we already did." After that, it became a game. A dangerous, exhilarating game. We'd find excuses to work late, to meet in the conference rooms, always careful to choose the ones with the best sightlines. The thrill of being so exposed, so visible, was addicting. Every time the door opened, Every time someone walked by, my heart would race, my body would tense, and I'd wonder, is this it? Is this the moment we get caught? But we never did. Our coworkers remained oblivious, their focus on their own work, their own lives. They'd join us in the meeting rooms, completely unaware of what had happened there just moments before, and the thought of it, the idea that they had no idea, only heightened the thrill. One afternoon, we were in the middle of a particularly heated discussion when the door suddenly opened. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze, panic flooding my veins. But it was just Greg from accounting, looking for a charger. He barely glanced at us before muttering an apology and leaving. "Close call," Lena whispered once the door clicked shut, her lips curling into a wicked smile. Her hand, which had been resting on my thigh, slid higher. "Guess we'll have to be more careful." "Or not," I replied, my voice hoarse. The idea of getting caught was intoxicating. Forbidden.
Wrong.
But that was what made it so irresistible. She laughed softly, her breath warm against my neck. "Naughty," she murmured, her fingers tracing patterns on my skin. "I like it." That was the thing about Lena. She liked the risk, the thrill of it all. It wasn't just about the sex, though that was undeniably incredible. It was about the danger, the idea that at any moment someone could walk in and discover us. The idea that, even in plain sight, we were invisible. But the closer we got to getting caught, the more reckless we became. We started taking bigger risks, pushing the boundaries of what we could get away with. The glass-walled meeting rooms, once a source of anxiety, became our playground. We'd leave the blinds open, just slightly, so that anyone who happened to glance our way might catch a glimpse of what we were really doing. And then there were the times when someone did walk into the room while we were in the middle of things. We'd sit there, pretending to be engrossed in a spreadsheet or a presentation, our bodies still tingling from what we'd just done. It was a rush unlike anything I'd ever experienced, a mix of fear, excitement, and raw, unadulterated desire. But as much as I tried to convince myself that it was just a game, I couldn't shake the guilt. The weight of what we were doing, the lives we were potentially ruining, was impossible to ignore. And yet, every time Lena looked at me with that mischievous glint in her eye, every time her lips met mine, I forgot all about the consequences. "So," Lena said, her voice breaking through my thoughts. We were in the break room, waiting for the coffee machine to finish its cycle. Her arms were crossed, her hip leaning casually against the counter. "What's next?" Her tone was casual, but there was a look in her eyes, a challenge, a promise. I glanced around the room, making sure no one was within earshot. "What do you mean?" She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against mine as she reached for a sugar packet. "I mean, we've done the meeting rooms.
We've done your desk.
What's the next office adventure?" My heart skipped a beat. She was serious. And so was I. "The executive lounge," I said quietly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "After hours." Her eyes lit up, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Interesting," she said, her voice low and sultry. "What time?" The clock on my computer screen ticked closer to 8 p.m. The open concept office had emptied out hours ago, the hum of keyboards and the murmur of conversation replaced by the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a reminder of the recklessness I was about to embrace. Lena's suggestion had been lingering in my mind all afternoon, a tantalizing promise of something forbidden. The executive lounge wasn't just a place, it was a statement. Glass walls, polished surfaces, and mirrors that reflected every angle of the room. It was a place where the higher-ups held meetings, made decisions, and, apparently, where Lena and I were about to cross another line. I stood up, grabbing my phone and pretending to stretch, glancing around to make sure no one else was lingering. Greg from accounting was still at his desk, his head down as he shuffled through a stack of papers. He was the only one left, completely oblivious to the tension radiating from me. I walked casually toward the lounge, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The automatic sliding doors hissed open, revealing the sleek interior of the room. The lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the floor-to-ceiling mirrors. My reflection stared back at me, betraying the nervous energy in my posture. I didn't have to wait long. Lena appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the faint light from the hallway. She stepped inside, the doors closing behind her with a soft whoosh. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step deliberate and unhurried. She wore a blouse that clung to her curves, the top button undone just enough to reveal a hint of skin. Her lips curved into that sly smile I'd come to crave, her eyes meeting mine in the mirror. "You actually came," she said, her voice low and teasing. She walked toward me, her hips swaying with a rhythm that made my breath hitch. "I wasn't sure if you'd chicken out." "Chickening out isn't really my style," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. She stopped inches away, her perfume enveloping me, a mix of vanilla and something darker, more dangerous. Her fingers traced the edge of my collar, sending a shiver down my spine. "Good," she whispered, her breath warm against my ear. "Because neither is mine." Her lips brushed against mine, a featherlight touch that sent sparks of electricity through me. I leaned into it, deepening the kiss as her hands slid up my chest, tugging at my tie. The room was silent except for the sound of our breathing, rapid and unsteady. Her fingers found the buttons of my shirt, slipping them open one by one. I reached for her blouse, my hands trembling slightly as I undid it, revealing the lace of her bra. She shrugged it off, letting it fall to the floor in a whisper of fabric. The mirrors reflected us from every angle, our movements multiplied, the intimacy magnified. Lena's hands roamed over my chest, her nails scraping lightly against my skin. I pulled her closer, my lips trailing down her neck, nipping at the sensitive spot beneath her ear. She gasped, her fingers tightening in my hair, urging me on. Our kisses grew more urgent, more desperate, as if we were trying to consume each other before anyone caught us. She pushed me back against the conference table, the cool surface pressing into my bare skin. Her hands were everywhere, exploring, claiming, and I let her, my own hands gripping her hips as she straddled me. Her lips found mine again, hungry and demanding, and I responded in kind, losing myself in the taste of her, the feel of her, the danger of her. "We're insane," I murmured against her lips, my voice hoarse with need. "Insane," she repeated, her laugh low and breathless. She leaned back slightly, her hands on my shoulders, her eyes locking with mine. "Maybe. But you love it." I did. I loved the way her body moved against mine, the way her breath hitched when my hands slipped under her skirt. I loved the way she made me forget every boundary, every rule, every consequence. I loved how alive I felt in these moments, how completely and utterly consumed by her I was. Her hands found the waistband of my pants, her fingers deftly undoing the button and zipper. She slid off the table, kneeling in front of me, her eyes never leaving mine as she pulled them down, freeing me from the confines of fabric. My breath caught in my throat as her lips wrapped around me, her tongue swirling in a way that made my vision blur. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. But it was slipping fast. Lena pulled back, her smile wicked as she stood. "Not yet," she said, her voice a purr. She turned, bending over the table, her hands gripping the edge. The mirrors reflected the curve of her back, the swell of her hips, and the look of sheer want on my face. I stepped closer, my hands tracing the lines of her body, savoring the way she shivered beneath my touch. "Lena," I whispered, my voice breaking. "We need to." "Shut up," she interrupted, glancing over her shoulder, her eyes dark with desire. "Don't think. Just feel." I did as she said, giving in to the primal need that had been building since the moment she'd walked into the lounge. My hands gripped her hips, aligning myself with her, and I pushed in slowly, savoring the way her breathing hitched, the way her back arched, the way her fingers clenched against the table. She was warm, tight, and mine, at least for now. The mirrors caught every move, every tremble, every gasp. I could see us from every angle, our bodies entwined, our faces flushed with pleasure, our movements growing more frenzied with each passing second. Lena's moans filled the room, a symphony of need and desperation that only spurred me on. I gripped her hips harder, thrusting deeper, faster, losing myself in the rhythm we created together. Her hand reached back, grabbing mine and pulling it to her mouth. She bit down on my fingers, her teeth sinking in just enough to send a jolt of pain through me. I groaned, the sensation only adding to the intensity of the moment. She let go, her voice a breathless whisper. "Don't stop." I didn't. I couldn't. The room spun around us, the mirrors reflecting our tangled bodies, the sweat glistening on our skin, the look of pure ecstasy on her face. I was close, so close, and I could feel her tightening around me, her moans growing louder, more urgent. She reached back, her hand gripping my thigh, her nails digging in as she cried out, her body shuddering with release. It was enough to tip me over the edge. My vision went white, my body convulsing as I spilled into her, every nerve in my body alight with overwhelming pleasure. I collapsed against her, pressing my forehead to her back as we both struggled to catch our breath. The room was silent except for the sound of our ragged breathing, the echo of our passion lingering in the air. Lena straightened, turning to face me, her lips swollen, her cheeks flushed. She reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face, her touch surprisingly tender. "See," she said, her voice soft but with that same teasing edge. "I told you, it would be worth it." I opened my mouth to respond, but the sound of the door sliding open cut me off. We froze, our eyes locking in panic. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing closer. Lena's eyes widened, her lips parting in a silent gasp. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline of being caught surging through me. The footsteps paused just outside the lounge, and I could see the shadow of someone standing in the doorway. Greg's voice broke the silence. "Hello? Anyone in here?" Before I could respond, Lena's hand shot out, grasping my wrist with a surprisingly firm grip. Her eyes locked onto mine, burning with a mixture of mischief and desperation. Without a word, she tugged me toward the door, her steps swift and silent. I stumbled after her, my heart still racing from the near miss with Greg. The executive washroom was just around the corner, its sleek, frosted glass door beckoning like a sanctuary. Lena's fingers fumbled with the lock as she pushed me inside, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The door clicked shut behind us, and she leaned against it, her chest rising and falling as she stared at me with wide, hungry eyes. "Round 2, she whispered, her voice low and sultry, dripping with promise. The washroom was dimly lit, the soft hum of the ventilation system, the only sound. The cool tile floor contrasted with the heat radiating from our bodies, and the scent of her perfume filled the air, intoxicating and familiar. Lena stepped closer, her hands sliding up my chest, her nails grazing the fabric of my shirt. Her lips curved into that sly smile I knew so well, the one that made my stomach tighten and my pulse quicken. "You're not scared, are you?" she teased, her voice a whisper against my ear. Her breath was warm, sending a shiver down my spine. Neither of us had a choice. The adrenaline still coursed through me, the thrill of almost getting caught making it impossible to think clearly. "Scared?" I shot back, my voice low and rough. "You're the one who dragged me in here." Her laugh was soft, melodic, and it sent a rush of heat through me. Her fingers found the hem of my shirt, tugging it upward. I complied, pulling it over my head and tossing it to the floor. Lena's gaze roamed over my chest, her eyes darkening with desire. She stepped closer, her body pressing against mine, and I could feel the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of her blouse. Her hand slid around my waist, pulling me closer, and her lips found mine in a searing kiss. It was hungry, desperate, as if we were both trying to chase away the lingering fear of being caught. Her tongue met mine, and I groaned, my hands tangling in her hair as I deepened the kiss. Her body pressed against me, her hips grinding into mine, and I could feel the heat building between us. Her hands were everywhere, touching, teasing, and I could barely keep up. She pulled back, her lips swollen and her cheeks flushed, and her fingers moved to the buttons of her blouse. She took her time, undoing them one by one, her eyes never leaving mine. When the last button was undone, she let the fabric slip from her shoulders, revealing the lace bra beneath. My breath caught in my throat as I took her in, the soft curves of her body illuminated by the dim light. "Like what you see?" she murmured, her voice dripping with confidence. Her hands moved to the waistband of her skirt, and she slowly slid it down her hips, letting it pool at her feet. I didn't answer, I couldn't. My eyes roamed over her body, taking in every curve, every dip, and I felt my mouth go dry. Lena stepped closer, her hands sliding at my chest as she pressed her body against mine. Her lips found my neck, and I tilted my head back, a moan escaping my lips as she nipped at the sensitive skin. "Lena," I breathed, my voice barely above a whisper. She pulled back, her eyes locking onto mine, and there was a flicker of something in her gaze, something raw and unfiltered. Her hands moved to my belt, and she undid it with practiced ease, her fingers brushing against me as she worked. My breath hitched, and I could feel the heat building between us, the anticipation almost too much to bear. Her hands slid into my pants, and I groaned, my hips bucking into her touch. She smirked, her fingers wrapping around me, and she began to stroke, her touch firm and sure. My eyes fluttered shut, and I leaned back against the sink, my hands gripping the edge as she worked. "Open your eyes," she commanded, her voice soft but firm. I obeyed, my gaze locking onto hers, and she smiled, her lips curving into that sly, teasing grin. Her free hand moved to her bra, and she undid the clasp, letting it fall away. Her hands slid up her body, her fingers brushing against her own skin, and I watched, mesmerized, as she touched herself. Her body was a work of art, and I couldn't look away. Her hands moved lower, and she hooked her fingers into the waistband of her panties, slowly sliding them down her hips. She stepped out of them, kicking them aside, and then she leaned forward, her lips brushing against mine. "Tell me what you want," she whispered, her breath warm against my lips. I didn't hesitate. "You." Her smile widened, and she stepped closer, her body pressing against mine. My hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer, and I could feel the heat of her skin against mine. She reached between us, guiding me to her, and I groaned as I felt her warmth envelop me. Her hands moved to my shoulders, her nails digging into my skin as she began to move. Her hips rolled against mine, and I gripped her waist, pulling her closer as we found a rhythm. The sound of our breathing filled the small space, mingling with the soft hum of the ventilation system. Lena's head fell back, her eyes fluttering shut as she moved. Her lips parted, and a soft moan escaped her lips, sending a jolt of heat through me. Her hands slid down my chest, her nails leaving trails of fire in their wake, and I groaned, my hips bucking into her. "Faster," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. I obliged, gripping her hips as I surged into her. Her back arched, and she cried out, her nails digging into my skin. Her body trembled against mine, and I could feel her tightening around me, her pleasure building with each thrust. "Don't stop," she gasped, her voice trembling with need. I couldn't have stopped if I tried. My body moved on its own, driven by the need to feel her, to claim her. Lena's hands moved to my shoulders, her nails digging into my skin as she held on, her body trembling with pleasure. "Please," she gasped, her voice trembling with need. "I'm so close." Her words sent a jolt of heat through me, and I gripped her hips, pulling her closer as I slammed into her. Her body tightened around me, and she cried out, her head falling back as wave after wave of pleasure crashed over her. "Lena." I breathed, my voice rough with need, as I felt my own release building. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at me, her gaze locking onto mine. Her lips curved into that sly, teasing smile, and she leaned forward, her lips brushing against my ear. "Let go," she whispered, her voice a soft, breathy moan. "I want to feel you." Her words were my undoing. My hips bucked into her, and I groaned, my release crashing over me like a tidal wave. My body trembled with pleasure, and I held her close, my fingers digging into her hips as I rode out the wave. For a moment, we stayed like that, our bodies pressed together, our breaths mingling as we came down from the high. Lena leaned her forehead against mine, her lips curving into that sly smile I knew so well. "See," she murmured, her voice soft and teasing. "I told you it'd be worth it." Before I could respond, the sound of the door handle rattling jolted us apart. My heart leaped into my throat, and I froze, my eyes wide with panic. Lena's lips were on mine in an instant, silencing any sound I might have made. "Greg," she whispered against my lips, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. "He's back." The handle rattled again, and I could hear Greg's voice on the other side of the door, muffled but unmistakable. "Is someone in there? I just need to wash my hands real quick." Lena's eyes met mine, and there was that flicker of mischief again, the one that made my stomach tighten and my pulse quicken. "What do you think?" she whispered, her lips brushing against my ear. "Wanna risk it?" The handle rattled again, louder this time, and Greg's voice cut through the silence with an impatient edge. "Hello? Anyone in there? I really need to wash my hands." Lena's breath hitched, her body pressing closer to mine, her warmth intoxicating even in this moment of potential disaster. "What do we do?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She tilted her head, her lips curling into that sly, mischievous smile that always set my nerves on fire. "We could be quiet," she murmured, her fingers tracing a slow, deliberate path down my chest. "Or we could let him in." My heart skipped a beat. Let him in, I echoed, my voice cracking slightly. She leaned in, her lips brushing against my ear, her breath hot and teasing. You've always liked the thrill of almost getting caught, haven't you? Imagine how much more intense it would be if he joined us. The suggestion hung in the air, heavy and electric, and for a moment, I couldn't think straight. The idea was insane, reckless, and yet, the way she said it, the way she looked at me, made it impossible to dismiss. The handle rattled again, and this time, Greg's voice was tinged with irritation. All right, I'm coming in. I don't care what's going on in there. Before I could react, Lena stepped back, her fingers lingering on my wrist for a heartbeat before she reached out and unlocked the door. It swung open, and there stood Greg, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion as he took in the scene before him. Lena, leaning casually against the counter, her blouse slightly disheveled, and me, frozen in place, my face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and something far more primal. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Greg raised an eyebrow, his gaze flickering between us. Well, he said dryly, this explains why you two are always disappearing together. Lena laughed, a low, melodic sound that sent a shiver down my spine. You caught us, she said, her voice dripping with feigned innocence. But honestly, Greg, I'm surprised it took you this long. Greg crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. Yeah, well, I'm not blind. I've seen the looks, the whispers, the way you two sneak off. I just didn't think you'd be stupid enough to do it right under everyone's noses. Lena stepped closer to him, her movements slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. Stupid? She repeated, her voice soft but laced with challenge. Or bold? Greg's eyes narrowed, but I could see the flicker of curiosity and something else in his gaze. You realize this could ruin both your careers, right? Not to mention your marriages. Lena's smile widened, and she reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. Or, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, it could be the most exciting thing you've ever done. You've always been so predictable, Greg. Don't you ever want to break the rules? To feel alive. I watched, transfixed, as the tension in the room shifted, becoming something darker, more intimate. Greg's jaw tensed, but he didn't pull away. Instead, his eyes lingered on Lena, and for the first time, I noticed the way his gaze dipped to her lips, the way his breathing quickened ever so slightly. Lena glanced over her shoulder at me, her eyes gleaming with mischief. What do you think? She asked, her voice a sultry purr. Should we let him in on our little secret? My mind raced, torn between the rational part of me that screamed this was a terrible idea and the part of me that was already intoxicated by the thought of it. The thrill of being caught, the danger of discovery, it was everything we'd been chasing. But this was something else entirely. Greg cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Look, I didn't come here for whatever this is. I just needed to wash my hands. Lena laughed again, the sound rich and warm. Sure you did, she said, her tone teasing. But admit it, Greg. You're curious. You've always wondered what it would be like to step outside your neat little box, haven't you? Greg hesitated, his gaze flickering between us, and in that moment, I could see the battle raging within him, the part of him that wanted to walk away, and the part of him that was undeniably drawn to the chaos Lena embodied. Finally, he let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. This is insane, he muttered, but there was a note of resignation in his voice, and something else. Lena's smile turned triumphant, and she reached out, her fingers curling around his wrist. Insane, she repeated, her voice dripping with mockery. Or exhilarating? Greg's gaze met hers, and for the first time, I saw the spark of desire in his eyes. You're playing with fire, Lena. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear as she whispered, and you're about to get burned. The air in the room grew thick, charged with an energy that was impossible to ignore. Greg's breath hitched, and his eyes flickered to me, searching for confirmation, for permission. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. Do it, I thought, the words echoing in my mind. Take the risk. And then, slowly, tentatively, Greg stepped closer, his hand reaching out to brush against Lena's cheek. She let out a soft sigh, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment before she turned to me, her gaze locking with mine. Are you ready? She asked, her voice low and sultry. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and nodded again. Yes. Lena smiled, that wicked, mischievous smile that always sent a shiver down my spine. Then let's make this unforgettable. She reached out, her fingers intertwining with mine, and then with Greg's, pulling us both closer until there was no space between us. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, and I could feel the heat radiating from their bodies, the desire that hung heavy in the air. Greg's breath was uneven, his hands trembling slightly as they roamed over Lena's body, his touch almost reverent. Lena's eyes stayed locked on mine, her gaze unwavering, as she guided his hand lower, her own fingers tugging at the hem of his shirt. "Don't overthink it," she murmured, her voice a soft, soothing melody. "Just feel." And then, finally, the dam broke. Greg's hands grew bolder, his touch more insistent, and Lena's laughter turned into a soft moan as she leaned into him, her body arching against his. I watched, my pulse racing, as the tension between them exploded, their kisses growing more heated, more desperate. Lena's hands tangled in Greg's hair, pulling him closer, and I could see the exact moment he let go of his inhibitions, the moment he gave in to the chaos. And then, her gaze shifted to me, her eyes dark with desire. "Don't just stand there," she said, her voice a husky whisper. "Join us." My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped closer, my hands trembling as they reached out to touch her, to touch him. The world outside the washroom door ceased to exist, and all that mattered was the heat of their bodies, the electricity that crackled between us. Lena's lips found mine, her kiss fierce and demanding, and then she pulled Greg into it, her hands guiding us both until there was no telling where one of us ended and the other began. The air was thick with the sound of our breaths, our moans, the wet clash of lips and tongues. Lena's hands were everywhere, touching, teasing, guiding, and I could feel Greg's hesitation melt away, replaced by a hunger that matched my own. "That's it," Lena whispered, her voice a soft, sultry purr. "Let go." And we did. The world outside the washroom door ceased to exist, and all that mattered was the heat of their bodies, the electricity that crackled between us. Lena's lips found mine, her kiss fierce and demanding, and then she pulled Greg into it, her hands guiding us both until there was no telling where one of us ended and the other began. The air was thick with the sound of our breaths, our moans, the wet clash of lips and tongues. Lena's hands were everywhere, touching, teasing, guiding, and I could feel Greg's hesitation melt away, replaced by a hunger that matched my own. "That's it," Lena whispered, her voice a soft, sultry purr. "Let me show you what you've been missing." And then, her hands moved lower, her fingers deft and sure, and the world seemed to dissolve into a haze of heat and sensation. The room was filled with the sound of our breaths, our moans, the wet clash of lips and tongues. Lena's hands were everywhere, touching, teasing, guiding, and I could feel Greg's hesitation melt away, replaced by a hunger that matched my own. "That's it," Lena whispered, her voice a soft, sultry purr. "Let me show you what you've been missing." And then, her hands moved lower, her fingers deft and sure, and the world seemed to dissolve into a haze of heat and sensation. Greg's breath hitched, his hands gripping the edge of the counter as Lena's lips trailed down his neck, her fingers working with practiced ease. He groaned, his head falling back, and I could see the moment he surrendered completely, his body trembling with need. "Lena," he gasped, his voice rough with desire. I can't." She silenced him with a kiss, her hands still moving, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. The sight of them together, the way their bodies moved in perfect sync, was intoxicating, and I could feel my own desire building, threatening to consume me. And then, she turned to me, her eyes dark with promise. "Your turn," she murmured, her voice a soft, sultry purr. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and her lips found mine once more, her kiss fierce and demanding. Her hands roamed over my body, her touch setting every nerve on fire, and I could feel the tension building, the need threatening to explode. "Lena," I gasped, my voice trembling. I don't know if I can." She silenced me with a kiss, her hands guiding me, and the world seemed to dissolve into a haze of heat and sensation. The room was filled with the sound of our breaths, our moans, the wet clash of lips and tongues. Lena's hands were everywhere, touching, teasing, guiding, and I could feel Greg's hesitation melt away, replaced by a hunger that matched my own. "That's it," Lena whispered, her voice a soft, sultry purr. "Let me show you what you've been missing." And then, her hands moved lower, her fingers deft and sure, and the world seemed to dissolve into a haze of heat and sensation. The room was thick with the scent of sweat and desire, the air crackling with the intensity of their forbidden union. Lena's hands were everywhere, her touch electric, while Greg's hesitant movements grew more confident, more desperate. The three of them moved together in a frenzied rhythm, their bodies pressed close, their breaths mingling in the small space of the washroom. The door handle rattled, and for a brief moment, they froze, their hearts pounding in unison. But no one entered, and the tension dissolved into a low, collective groan of relief. Lena laughed softly, her voice a seductive whisper. "Close calls are my favorite part," she murmured, her lips brushing against my ear as she spoke. Greg's eyes met mine, wide with a mix of guilt and exhilaration, and I could see the same hunger mirrored in his gaze. But then, the door swung open. The sound was sharp, cutting through the haze of pleasure like a knife. Light spilled into the room, and there she stood, silhouetted in the doorway, Greg's wife, Claire. She was impeccably dressed, her hair perfectly styled, her lips curved into a knowing smile. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, swept over the scene before her, taking in the disheveled state of the room, the flushed faces, the tangled limbs. "Well," she said, her voice cool and measured, "this is quite the sight." Greg's face paled, his jaw dropping open as he stumbled back, his hands fumbling to adjust his clothing. Lena, however, didn't move. She tilted her head, her lips curving into a sly smile, as if she'd been expecting this. "Claire," she said, her voice smooth and unbothered. "Fancy seeing you here." Claire stepped into the room, her heels clicking softly against the tile floor. She closed the door behind her with a deliberate click, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. "Oh, I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she replied, her gaze flicking to me, then back to Lena. "You've been busy, haven't you?" My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Claire's calmness was unnerving, her demeanor almost pleased. She didn't look angry or betrayed. If anything, she looked like she'd just caught us in the middle of a game she'd been orchestrating all along. "What the hell are you doing here?" Greg demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and confusion. He took a step toward her, his hands outstretched as if to plead for understanding. "This isn't what it looks like." Claire laughed, a soft, melodic sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Oh, Greg," she said, her tone almost pitying. "It's exactly what it looks like. And that's precisely why I'm here." She turned her attention to Lena, her smile widening. "You've done well, Lena. Better than I expected, actually." Lena's smirk deepened, and she leaned back against the sink, her posture relaxed, almost smug. "I aim to please," she replied, her tone dripping with innuendo. "Wait a minute," I said, my voice hoarse. "What's going on here?" Claire's gaze shifted to me, her eyes glittering with amusement. "You're part of the game, darling," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I set this whole thing up. Every meeting, every close call, every intimate moment. It was all part of my plan." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My stomach twisted, and I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. "You set this up?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Claire nodded, her smile never wavering. "Of course. I've known about Lena's little proclivities for a while now. And I knew Greg was growing restless in our marriage. So I thought, why not give them both a little excitement?" Greg stared at her, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. You planned this?" he stammered. "Why would you do that?" Claire tilted her head, her expression almost sympathetic. "Because, Greg, I wanted to see how far you'd go. How much you'd risk. And honestly, I'm not disappointed." Lena laughed softly, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the edge of the sink. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Claire," she said, her tone playful. "I have to admit, it's been fun playing your little game." Claire's gaze softened as she looked at Lena, and for a moment, there was something almost affectionate in her expression. "You've always been my favorite player, Lena," she said, her voice low and intimate. "You know how to keep things interesting." The air between them crackled with an unspoken tension, and I felt a pang of jealousy, though I couldn't explain why. Lena glanced at me, her eyes glinting with mischief, and I knew, in that moment, that I'd been nothing more than a pawn in their twisted little game. Claire stepped closer to Lena, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached out, her fingers brushing against Lena's cheek in a gesture that was almost tender. "You've done well," she murmured, her voice soft. but I think it's time we brought this game to its natural conclusion. Lena's smile widened, and she leaned into Claire's touch, her eyes closing briefly. And what did you have in mind? She asked, her voice a sultry whisper. Claire's hand slid down Lena's neck, her fingers lingering on the curve of her shoulder. Oh, I think you know, she replied, her tone teasing. After all, you've always been so good at finishing what you started. Lena's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile, and she took a step closer to Claire, their bodies almost touching. Careful, Claire, she said, her voice low. You might just get more than you bargained for. Claire's laugh was soft, almost intimate. Oh, Lena, she said, her gaze locking with Lena's. I'm counting on it. The room seemed to shrink around us, the tension thickening until it was almost suffocating. Greg stood frozen, his eyes darting between Claire and Lena, his confusion and fear palpable. I felt a strange mix of arousal and unease, my body reacting to the charged atmosphere even as my mind struggled to process what was happening. Claire's hand slid down to Lena's waist, her grip firm but not unkind. Shall we? She asked, her voice a soft whisper. Lena's smile was all the answer she needed. She turned to look at me, her eyes glinting with mischief. Care to join us? She asked, her tone playful. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know, I stammered, my voice shaky. Lena's smile widened, and she reached out, her fingers brushing against mine. Come on, she murmured, her voice soft. You know you want to. And as her fingers closed around mine, I felt myself being pulled into the whirlwind of their game, unsure of where it would lead, but unable to resist. Claire's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a smirk that sent a shiver down my spine. Did you really think this was all just a game? She purred, her voice smooth and calculated. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the tile floor, echoing in the confined space of the washroom. Or did you think I was just some oblivious wife, turning a blind eye to my husband's extracurricular activities? Greg paled, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Claire, I didn't, he stammered, but she cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. Save it, Greg, she snapped, her tone icy. I've known for weeks. I've known about Lena. I've known about him. She gestured toward me, her gaze piercing. I've been watching, waiting, planning. Lena, ever the provocateur, leaned against the sink, her arms crossed over her chest. She looked almost amused, as if she'd been expecting this all along. And what exactly is your plan, Claire? She asked, her voice dripping with curiosity. Claire's smirk deepened, and she took another step forward, closing the distance between us. Simple, she said, her voice low and dangerous. You're all going to do exactly as I say. Or else. Greg's eyes widened, and he shook his head. Claire, you can't be serious. I'm deadly serious, she interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek black phone, holding it up for all of us to see. Do you know what's on here? She asked, her gaze flicking between us. Pictures, videos, audio recordings. Enough evidence to ruin all of your lives. Your careers, your marriages, everything. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on me, and my stomach churned with dread. Lena, however, seemed unfazed. She tilted her head, her lips curving into a sly smile. And what do you want from us, Claire? She asked, her tone almost intrigued. Claire's eyes locked onto Lena's, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of us had ceased to exist. Obedience, she said simply. You're going to do exactly as I say when I say it. No questions. No hesitation. And if you're good, she trailed off, her gaze flicking to me, and then back to Lena. Well, let's just say there might be rewards. Lena's smile widened, and she took a step closer to Claire. Sounds like my kind of game, she murmured, her voice low and sultry. But tell me, Claire, what's in it for you? Claire's smirk turned predatory, and she reached out, her fingers brushing against Lena's cheek. Control, she whispered. The thrill of knowing I'm pulling the strings. Watching you all squirm, wondering what I'll demand next. That's what's in it for me. The tension in the room was palpable, a taut wire ready to snap. Greg looked like he was about to collapse under the weight of Claire's demands, and I could feel the cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. But Lena, she looked alive, her eyes sparkling with excitement. All right, Lena said, her voice soft but firm. I'm in. What's your first command? Claire's smirk widened, and she took a step back, her gaze sweeping over all of us. Strip, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. All of you. Greg's eyes widened in shock, and he shook his head. Claire, you can't. Now, Greg, she snapped, her voice sharp and commanding. Or, do you want me to send these pictures to HR? To your parents? To your in-laws? Greg swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he reached for the buttons on his shirt. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, but Lena's eyes met mine, and she gave a subtle nod. Slowly, I began to unbutton my shirt, my fingers fumbling as the room seemed to close in around me. Lena, of course, had no such reservations. She peeled off her blouse with practiced ease, letting it fall to the floor in a heap. Her movements were deliberate, her body on full display as she stepped closer to Claire. Is this what you wanted? She asked, her voice low and teasing. Claire's eyes darkened, and she reached out, her fingers tracing a line down Lena's arm. Almost, she murmured, but not quite. Greg had finally managed to remove his shirt, though his hands were still shaking, and I could see the fear and uncertainty in his eyes. He looked so out of his depth, so vulnerable, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for him. But then Claire's gaze turned to me, and all thoughts of Greg vanished. You're next, she said, her voice soft but commanding. All of it. My heart was racing now, and my hands trembled as I reached for my belt. I could feel Claire's eyes on me, watching every movement, every hesitation. The air was thick with tension, and I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven. Finally, I stood there, completely exposed, my body on display for Claire's scrutiny. She took a step closer, her eyes roaming over me with a predatory gleam. Good, she murmured, her voice low and approving. Now kneel. The command sent a jolt through me, and I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing. But Lena's voice broke through the silence. Soft but firm. Do as she says, she murmured, her eyes meeting mine. It's easier if you just play along. With a deep breath, I lowered myself to my knees, the cold tile biting into my skin. The room was silent, save for the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. Claire's smirk widened, and she stepped closer, her heels clicking against the floor. Good boy, she purred, her voice dripping with satisfaction. She reached out, her fingers tangling in my hair, and I could feel the tension in her grip. The air in the room was thick, suffocating, as Claire's fingers tightened in my hair. Her nails scraped lightly against my scalp, sending a shiver down my spine. I knelt there, completely at her mercy, the cold tile beneath me a stark reminder of my vulnerability. Lena stood a few feet away, watching intently, her lips slightly parted as if she were holding her breath. Greg, still visibly shaken, knelt beside me, his eyes darting nervously between Claire and the floor. Good boy, Claire repeated, her voice a low purr that seemed to reverberate through the room. She tilted my head back, forcing me to meet her gaze. Her eyes were dark, swirling with something I couldn't quite place. Power, control, maybe even amusement. Now, let's see how obedient you can be. Her free hand trailed down my shoulder, her touch deliberate, almost clinical. She paused at my chest, her fingers grazing over my skin with a lightness that made my breath hitch. You've been a very naughty boy, haven't you? She murmured, her voice slipping into a silky, almost mocking tone. Sneaking around with Lena in my office in my house. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I'm sorry. I stammered, the words clumsy and inadequate. Claire's smirk deepened, and she leaned in closer, her lips brushing against my ear as she whispered, Sorry isn't going to cut it, darling. You're going to have to show me how sorry you are. Her breath was warm against my skin, and I could feel the heat of her body radiating just inches away. My mind raced, torn between fear and an inexplicable pull toward her. This was madness. She was Greg's wife, for God's sake. But there was something intoxicating about her, something that made it impossible to look away. Lena stepped forward then, her movements slow and deliberate. She knelt beside me, her eyes locked on Claire's. Let me help, she murmured, her voice low and sultry. He's inexperienced, but I can guide him. Claire's gaze shifted to Lena, and for a moment, the two women seemed to communicate in silence, a shared understanding passing between them. Then Claire nodded, a sly smile playing on her lips. Very well. Show him how it's done. Lena turned to me, her eyes softening as she cupped my face in her hands. Relax, she whispered, her voice soothing. Just follow my lead. Her lips met mine in a kiss that was both gentle and demanding, her tongue teasing its way into my mouth. I hesitated for a moment, my mind still reeling, but then I gave in, letting myself get lost in the sensation. Her hand slid down my chest, her touch igniting a fire that spread through my entire body. Claire watched quietly, her hands still tangled in my hair, her presence a constant reminder of the power she held over all of us. When Lena finally pulled away, I was breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. "Good," Claire murmured, her voice low and approving. "Now let's see if he can do better." Lena sat back on her heels, her eyes gleaming with anticipation as she watched me. Claire's grip on my hair tightened again, and she tilted my head back, forcing me to meet her gaze once more. "Your turn," she said, her voice a silky command. "Show me what you're capable of." My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, arousal, confusion, but there was no escaping this. I leaned forward, my lips brushing against hers in a tentative kiss. She responded immediately, her mouth pressing against mine with a fierceness that took my breath away. Her hands moved to my shoulders, her nails digging into my skin as she deepened the kiss. I could feel her dominance, her control, and it only fueled the fire building inside me. I kissed her back with a desperation I didn't know I was capable of, my hands gripping her hips as if she were the only thing keeping me grounded. When she finally pulled away, I was panting, my chest heaving with the effort of keeping up with her. She smirked, her fingers trailing down my cheek as she murmured, "Not bad. But I think we can do better, don't you?" She stepped back then, her eyes sweeping over the three of us as if we were pieces on a chessboard. Greg was still kneeling beside me, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. Claire's gaze lingered on him for a moment, and then she turned to Lena, a sly smile playing on her lips. "Lena, darling," she purred, her voice dripping with mischief. "Would you be so kind as to assist?" Lena's eyes sparkled with mischief as she nodded, a smirk tugging at her lips. She moved behind Greg, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. He tensed, his eyes darting nervously between her and Claire, but he didn't protest. "Relax, Greg," Lena murmured, her voice low and soothing. "Just let go." Her hand slid down his chest, her touch light but deliberate. Greg's breathing hitched, and he let out a low groan as her lips brushed against the back of his neck. Claire watched intently, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction as Lena began to undress him, her movements slow and unhurried. I couldn't tear my eyes away, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched the scene unfold. Claire stepped closer to me, her fingers tangling in my hair once more as she leaned down to whisper in my ear. "This is your chance, darling," she murmured, her voice low and sultry. "Show me what you're made of." Her words sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I leaned forward, my lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both desperate and demanding. Her hands moved to my waist, her nails digging into my skin as she pulled me closer. The room was filled with the sound of heavy breathing, of whispered commands and low moans, as the tension in the air reached its peak. Lena's hands were everywhere, her touch igniting a fire that seemed to consume us all, while Claire dominated with a quiet, unrelenting power that left no room for resistance. And then, just as the heat became unbearable, Claire pulled away, her eyes locked on mine as she murmured, "Open your eyes. Watch." I did as I was told, my gaze shifting to where Lena was now kneeling in front of Greg, her hands resting lightly on his thighs as she looked up at him with a smirk. "Your turn," Claire whispered, her voice low and commanding. "Show me what you're capable of." Greg hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting nervously between Lena and Claire. But then he leaned forward, his hands trembling as he reached for Lena's waist. Lena's smirk deepened, and she turned to Claire, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "Ready?" she asked, her voice low and sultry. Claire nodded, a sly smile playing on her lips. "Let's see what he's made of." Greg's hands tightened on Lena's waist, and he leaned forward, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was both tentative and desperate. Lena responded immediately, her hands sliding up his chest as she deepened the kiss. Claire watched intently, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction as the two of them lost themselves in the moment. She stepped closer to me, her fingers tangling in my hair once more as she leaned down to whisper in my ear. "Your turn," she murmured, her voice low and sultry. "Show me what you're made of." Her words sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I leaned forward, my lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both desperate and demanding. Her hands moved to my waist, her nails digging into my skin as she pulled me closer. The room was filled with the sound of heavy breathing, of whispered commands and low moans, as the tension in the air reached its peak. Lena's hands were everywhere, her touch igniting a fire that seemed to consume us all, while Claire dominated with a quiet, unrelenting power that left no room for resistance. And then, just as the heat became unbearable, Claire pulled away, her eyes locked on mine as she murmured, "Open your eyes. Watch." I did as I was told, my gaze shifting to where Lena was now kneeling in front of Greg, her lips brushing against his chest as she whispered something in his ear. Claire's smirk deepened, and she leaned down to whisper in my ear, "Good boy. Now, let's see what happens next."